Great. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Transport and Environment's European Car Climate Summit here in sunny Madrid, at which we'll be discussing the looming decision time for zero emissions. My name is Joe Miller. I'm the Frankfurt correspondent for the Financial Times, covering the European car industry, and I'm delighted to be moderating this event today. Before we start, just some housekeeping to get through. This event will be held in English, largely due to my own linguistic limitations, but there will be live interpretation provided in French, German, Italian, Polish, and Spanish. Now, those of you in the room should have headsets which give you those choices. Those of you joining online, you can select your preferred language in Zoom, a feature I was not familiar with until a couple of hours ago, but it should be on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. There should be an option to choose one of those languages. And secondly, please feel free to join the conversation on social media, and you can do so by using the hashtag CarSummit2022. That's easy enough. Now, on to today's packed agenda. As I'm sure you all know, as you'll hear today, the EU is just weeks away from deciding on a date by which all new cars and vans registered in the bloc must be emissions-free. And I can certainly tell you that when I speak to executives in the auto industry these days, this is unsurprisingly near the top of almost everyone's agenda, at least in Europe. And the issue, of course, could not be more urgent. Cars account for roughly 12% of Europe's total CO2 emissions, and for many people in many parts of the continent, there really is no viable alternative to road transport, at least not in the near future. A fact that's quite easy to forget when you're sitting in Madrid or Frankfurt, where I am. So decarbonization is really the only way forward. Now, since last year, we've known that the European Commission's proposal is for a 2035 deadline, after which all new cars and vans must be zero emission. The big question, however, is how much support it will have, both from member states, from the businesses I mentioned, from workers, from consumers, in making this very rapid switch to electric. And then, of course, there's the question of how truly sustainable this transition really is, especially when it comes to battery manufacturing. Well, luckily today we have a stellar lineup of political and industry leaders to help us make sense of these questions. We have an opening keynote address by Pascal Canfin MEP, chair of the Committee of Environment, Public Health and Food Safety at the European Parliament, followed by 3 panels in which we'll dive much more deeply into the regulatory, social and environmental frameworks required for this truly epoch-defining technological shift. But first, a short welcome from our hosts today at this venue, which is the European Commission's representation in Spain. And I'd like to welcome up to the stage Lucas Gonzalez, who's the deputy head of this representation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. I would like to first welcome everybody to these relevant events, the European Car Climate Summit, organized by Transport and Environment. Today, as we always say, this is the house of Europe and it's the house of all EU citizens. Bien sûr, bienvenue Monsieur Pascal Canfin qui va faire la keynote speech, and the rest of very talented speakers that we have today. Today, you will be discussing on 2 very pertinent topics. First, the climate action, and second, the automotive industry. Both are extremely relevant for the Commission, and we are committed to striking a proper balance between both. The automotive sector is the 4th largest export sector, and it represents 15% of total Spanish exports. It's as well very important and relevant for the other EU countries. The Green Deal, as one of our 6 priorities and the Fit for 55 package, at the core of our discussions and our daily work in the Commission and all EU institutions. And under the umbrella of the Next Generation EU and the Resilience and Recovery Facility, the Commission is financing projects fitting well and supporting both our European Green Deal and more ambitious targets for the Fit for 55. Transport is indeed one of the sectors where there is more room for decarbonization. This is something that we have repeated many times, and electrification of vehicles can very much help in this task. We are stepping up our efforts to reinforce our strategic autonomy, both for vehicles and for the raw materials needed to produce electric vehicles. And of course, the work on the European Battery Alliance is a very important milestone, I think. In Spain, the strategic projects for economic recovery and transformation, the so-called PERTEs, are a new public-private collaboration figure created in 2020 for the implementation of the Recovery and Transformation Resilience Plan. The so-called PERTEs prove particularly helpful for the implementation of this recovery plan, and it is a good example of good practice here in Spain. They seek to transform the whole value chain in a given industry, in this case the one on the automotive and the car industry, from research to innovation to industrial development, including the necessary skills. In doing so, it seeks to correct market failures, potential market failures, such as the underinvestment by private initiatives due to significant risks. PERTES sought to reflect at national level the major projects of common European interest, such as those for batteries, as I have mentioned. These are projects of a strategic nature with significant potential to have a knock-on effect on the rest of the economy, and which require collaboration between administration, companies, and research centers in order to scale up their operations in our country. The first PERTE approved by the Council of Ministers under the RRP was precisely the electric and connected vehicle. It was approved in July 2021. And as said, this is not the only one. I mean, 8 others have followed on health, renewables, storage, and agri-food. These are only some of the examples. And this PERTE focuses on the Spanish economy's strategic sectors with a pull effect due to its share of domestic GDP and direct and indirect employment and its contribution to the trade balance. This PERTE calls for a total investment of more than 24 billion for the period 2021-2023. And it intends to deploy private investment of almost 20 billion euros. And the measures contained in the project are both transformative and enabling. SMEs are also part of this transformation, and this is a requirement for the project that was retaken in the state aid decision that we have taken weeks ago. State aid clearance by the Commission was done as said, and today, I think is a good opportunity to discuss on all these topics, of course, at this Spanish level, but not only at the European level and at global level. We have 3 very interesting panels, as mentioned by Joe, and I wish you all the best for your interventions and for the fruitful discussions that I'm sure that you will have. So thank you very much. You're at home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucas. That was a very helpful setting out of parts of the agenda that we will be coming to, as I say, with those 3 panels I mentioned earlier. But without further ado, before we go to our keynote speech, a short welcome by the Executive Director of Transport and Environment, William Todd. William, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe, and good to see you all. It's great to be here today. It's great to be in Madrid for our first European Car Climate Summit. And I'm particularly pleased to be in Madrid because Madrid is the capital of one of Europe's great automotive nations, but it's also the capital of a country that is today and will be in the future most affected by the accelerating climate crisis. As you know, and as was said, transport is one of the main drivers of this climate crisis. It is the largest source of carbon dioxide emissions in the European Union, and that is the case in most industrial nations. Now, since the 1990s, transport emissions have gone up consistently. And there was a moment around 2 years ago where we were hoping that the COVID crisis would change things. I don't know if you remember, we were all hoping that there would be a new normal, that people would change their behavior, that as a result of that changed behavior, oil demand would structurally decline. I'm sorry to say that this is not the case. Oil demand in the road transport sector has fully recovered from pre-pandemic levels. Only aviation demand hasn't come back to its 2019 levels, but it will probably by summer. Nobody is going to solve this problem for us. There will be no Deus ex machina. Now, I'm describing here what is a very challenging situation, but I would also like to emphasize the opportunity. I've been in this organization for 11 years, and what I've observed over the last couple of years is a tremendous change in the technology, in the willingness of the automotive industry to engage. And the fact that Ford is here today, the fact that Ford and Volvo signed up to a joint statement with us yesterday is testimony to that. And I think we have today in the transport sector a unique opportunity to accelerate these emission reductions that we so desperately need. And it is true, this is a decisive moment. In the next 3 weeks, we will have a decision in the European Parliament on the car CO2 standards. Ministers are discussing these same standards. We hear they're closing in on a deal as well. And what they decide will determine the future of our automotive industry, its workforce, but above all, the future of our planet. So as was said a number of times, we have a very impressive lineup today. We will hear from ministers, we will hear from members of the European Parliament, from senior executives of major companies, from trade unionists. And we have, of course, Joe Miller, who I hope will ask these distinguished guests some tough questions. Now, before I hand over back to Joe, I want to briefly share my own thoughts and emotions about this topic. I'm a Belgian. I left home this morning, and to my great surprise, when I arrived in Madrid, the temperature was exactly the same as in Belgium. It has been very sunny in my country for a very long time. It is the driest year so far. And recently, the Water Authority had to come on television to reassure people that there was enough water. And they told us that there's certainly enough water until September. This is Belgium. Belgium is the rainiest country in the continent, perhaps with the exception of Ireland and the UK. So make no mistake, the climate crisis is here today. It is accelerating. We need to act. At the same time, the war in Ukraine is showing us the cost of our oil addiction. We are sending 100 billion euros to Putin every year. This must end, and we can end it. As I said, over the last couple of years, we have seen tremendous change, in particular in the renewable energy sector and the automotive sector. And I think the combination of renewable power with electrification is the cocktail or the killer app, if you like, that will free us of our dependence on Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the other oil dictators, but it will also help us defeat global warming. Now, our mission as an organization is to deliver clean mobility for all Europeans. Clean mobility is much more than electric cars. Clean mobility is clean, livable cities. It's safe cycling. It's good public transport. It's not traveling where you don't have to travel. But the reality is that millions of Europeans do rely on cars, and we need solutions for those people. Electric cars offer that solution. I'm an EV driver myself. I've been relying on the public charging network for the last couple of months after I moved house. I can tell you it works very, very well. And I can tell you that an electric car is the best car out there today. So if you're hesitating between ICE and electric, go for electric. The question is, how can we make EVs accessible to all Europeans, not just to people that are more privileged? And I think the answer is, and I'm happy that we have a representative from Ford here today, because I think the key to success is to repeat a trick that we tried 100 years ago, and it is called mass manufacturing. We are mass manufacturing combustion engines at the scale of tens of millions of vehicles every year, and that explains why they are affordable to all. We need to do the same thing for electric vehicles. If we do that, over the next couple of years, these vehicles will become affordable to all Europeans. We will achieve price parity, and that will make them irresistible because they are already cheaper to own. But the question whether or not we will rapidly transition to EVs and to mass manufacturing is a question to which we will get an answer in the car CO2 standards debate. Because it is this law that tells manufacturers what they are expected to do in the next couple of years. And to close off my intro remarks, I think for me there's three big questions. The Commission put a proposal on the table that essentially allows car makers to do very little until 2030. Do we, as European Union, in light of the climate crisis, in light of the Russia war, do we really think it is acceptable to not accelerate the uptake of electric vehicles and fuel-efficient vehicles until 2030? Question mark. Do we really think that a target of minus 55% is sufficient? If you know that car makers, such as some of the major brands that we all know, have committed to much higher targets that would allow us to get to minus 65 or even minus 70%. Question mark. Is minus 55 good enough? Final question. Are we going to continue pretending plug-in hybrid vehicles, big SUVs with small batteries? Are we going to continue pretending these are green vehicles that are just as good electric vehicles? Are we going to recognize that they're actually not that great a solution? I think these are some of the questions that I hope to get some answers to, and I really look forward to this debate. And I'm really happy to be here. And yeah, Joe, good luck, and I hope and I wish you all a very good conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you, William, for those opening remarks. You mentioned there that nobody is going to solve this problem for us, quite ominously. But thankfully, for our keynote, we have one of the people who is working on solving this problem for us, on behalf of us, with us. And so without further ado, as long as the link is up and running, I would like to introduce Pascal Canfin, as I mentioned earlier, chair of the Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety at the European Parliament, for our keynote address. Pascal, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? I guess it's fine. So thank you to all. Okay, I guess you can hear me well.
We can hear you well, Pascal.
Good.
We can hear you well.
Okay, so I go ahead. Thank you. And of course, big thank you to Transport and Environment, not only for convening this summit today, but also for the very valuable work. I cannot insist more on the valuable work that you have been doing on these topics with science-based approach, pragmatic but ambitious, which is exactly what we need. Thank you for that. So as you said, we are approaching the money time. So the money time is when we are going to make the final decisions on key elements of the shift to electric mobility. So first, obviously, in the coming days, we'll vote in the plenary, and I hope that we will decide that we will stick to the Commission proposal, meaning that we go for full zero emissions cars by 2035. I know that some would like to have it closer, 2030. To be honest, first, there is no majority for that. Second, in order to handle and properly manage the social dimension of that, I think it's impossible at the European scale. It doesn't mean that for some countries, for some car makers, it is not possible. It's obvious that some of them will be by 2030 full zero emissions, but not all of us. So that's why 2035 is, to my view, the good balance date between 2030, which is too early, and 2040, which is obviously too late when it comes to climate ambition. We have confirmed this Commission proposal in the last committee vote last week, and of course, I will do everything I can to confirm it in the plenary. As it was said, and it's of course very good news, the Council is negotiating this as well in parallel, under the French presidency. And on last Friday, no country raised the fact that they couldn't support zero emissions by 2035 for passenger cars. So it's not agreed in the council, but it's going very, very good in the right direction. So that's part, of course, it's very short term. It's probably the most important decision we have to make on that front. But then we have coming for July and then September, and in the council, I hope under the French presidency, so before July, the deal on the infrastructure, the charging points infrastructure, because you cannot disconnect the cars and the infrastructure. So then we have to have an ambitious text that is at least in line with our target, because otherwise it's a bit chicken and egg, and you do not deploy massively what you have to, because there is a lack of trust for the final consumer. So that's why the charging text is very important. Then ahead of us, before the end of the year, we will have the CO2 standards for trucks, which will be another big battle. At that stage, I'm very open and still listening to the ones saying that it is for batteries to win, others saying, no, it's for hydrogen to win. We will see. But in any case, when it comes to the standards, so the level of performance of the engine, obviously, we should go for zero emissions trucks by a certain date, which cannot be later than 2040. Again, if it's after 2040, it doesn't make sense. So is it possible to go before 2040, as we are about to do for cars? That's on the table. Of course, I would be very happy to do so if, practically speaking, it is feasible. But of course, on our table, it's not only the mobility text, it's the whole Green Deal text. And if you want to shift from fossil mobility to electric mobility, you have to produce electricity. And that's another big element of the Green Deal, and on the agenda very short term. Today, you have probably seen that the Commission just released the Repower communication, where it now supports the target for 2030 of 45% of renewable for the total of our consumption in the EU, not only for electricity, for the total of our energy consumption. It's massive. As a reminder, today we are 22%. So it means 7 years to double what we have been built for decades. So just this figure gives you the size of the challenge and the size of the target we are negotiating and again about to agree, because there is a majority in the parliament to support the 45%, and the council is discussing it also under the French presidency. So just this few texts, I just mentioned four of them, are massively changing the landscape of mobility and power generation. All of that, of course, in the context, and that will be my conclusion, all of that in the context of the war in Ukraine, where, of course, we need to diversify gas supply. And it's obvious that we cannot do without securing additional contracts with the US, Qatar, Algeria, and a few other countries, obviously. But it has to remain a tiny part of the solution. And the beauty of the communication of today by the Commission to the battle plan is that associated to this battle plan, there is an investment plan. And this investment plan is 210 billion euros up to 2027. And 95% of these 210 billion euros will be dedicated to the green transition. So energy efficiency, zero carbon power generation, grids, and so on. 5% for additional gas pipelines or terminals, which are, as I said, needed, but has to be limited. And it means this figure, this mere figure means that we are going into the right direction and that we are not at all derailing the Green Deal because of the war in Ukraine, but on the contrary, we are speeding up the Green Deal because it's not part of the problem, it's part of the solution. And of course, part of this solution of the Green Deal is the electric mobility. And you can count on me to deliver on these objectives based on a few principles, which is ambition, science-based, climate robustness, but also taking into account industrial concerns, because if we divide our society, if we split the alliance we have with the progressive business, and a lot of car makers now are shifting massively their business plans, we need to work together to make sure that we can collectively deliver. That's why I think for that from 2030, it's too early. And from the social dimension. And I will end there. Social dimension, it's part of what the added value of what we will bring in the trilogue, so the negotiation between the Parliament and the Council, because we adopted in the committee last week, and it will be massively supported as well, beginning of June in the Parliament, the idea of a just transition fund for the automotive workers, not for the big car makers, because mainly for them it means changing their supply chain, changing their subcontractors, but they can't do it without massive public money. But for the subcontractors, for the tier 2, tier 3 subcontractors, which are today completely locked into a ICE value chain. And to be honest, we have to deal with this issue. Otherwise, we take a risk of political acceptance, of what we are doing. So that's why we are putting on the table, exactly as we did for coal a few years ago, the idea of a just transition fund for the automotive sectors, targeting medium-sized companies on the value chain and their workers, so that we can help them to transit from fossil-based to zero-emission-based mobility. Thank you for sharing this with me, and I know that I can count on you as well in terms of ambition for this challenge we have ahead of us.
Thank you very, very much, Pascal. Good to know we can count on you. Thanks for that comprehensive overview of the legislative landscape and what is possible, but also jumping ahead there to the value chain, which we will come on to later, a very important part of the puzzle, and how the smaller parts of the automotive sector can be brought along in this transition. But only remains for me to thank you very much for taking your time today. I'm sure you're a very busy man. So ladies and gentlemen, please thank Pascal Canfin for his time and for his keynote address. Right, well, without further ado, we are on to the first of our three panels. This one is on how the EU car CO2 standards help member states meet their climate commitments. And with us today virtually, I hope everyone is joined. I can see at least two people on my screen, and we're waiting for a third. But we have Christiane Rohleder, who is the State Secretary at the Ministry of Environment in Germany, Ministry of Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety and Consumer Protection, to give it its full name. We have with us as well from Italy, Enrico Giovannini, who is the Minister for Sustainable Transport and Infrastructure. And although I can't see him, I'm assuming we have Joan Groizard, who's Director General of the Spanish Institute for Energy Diversification and Savings. Please welcome them all, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Christiane, I can definitely see you and the ministry background behind you. So we'll start with you if that's okay. Pascal mentioned there that there are there's no real opposition amongst member states to the 2035 deadline. And Germany announced at the last Environmental Council meeting in March that it would support the Commission's proposal in all of its elements, including the 2035 date. And this is the first time that Germany has not pushed to actually lower the ambition, but gone with the proposals as they are. What has changed in Germany?
So thank you very much. Can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly well.
Thank you. So let's say it's the first time Germany supports quite ambitious CO2 standards. The Commission proposal is not so ambitious in the short term, but it is quite ambitious in the long term, with the proposal to phase out of new internal combustion engines in cars and vans from 2035, which wouldn't have been imaginable only a few years before. I think this is also that we support this now. It's due to the urgent climate crisis. Everybody can know now, everybody sees now and feels how urgent this climate crisis is. So politics, society and industry alike have all become much more serious about tackling climate crisis. And I would also say we have to speed on even more. Many car makers are planning to phase out internal combustion engines already in the early 2030s or even the 2020s, because there is a demand for zero-emission cars, and EU and national legislative bodies are willing to provide the necessary regulatory framework.
Thank you.
Dani.
Thank you very much.
Sono in conferenza.
Christiane, I'm hearing something, just one moment. I think there's possibly some of the translation coming through. It's gone now. Well, over to you, Enrico. We've just heard the view from Germany there. Your ministry, correct me if I'm wrong, has commissioned and published a report known as the STEMI report, I believe, that presents the best roadmap for, in your view, for transport decarbonization in Italy. Perhaps you could just briefly describe the main findings of that report for us regarding road transport, and in particular when it comes to the decarbonization of cars and vans.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. First of all, let me say that the Italian Interministerial Committee on Ecological Transition, which brings together different ministers who are in charge of the different dimensions of the ecological transition, made a decision a few months ago in saying 2035 as proposed by the European Commission is fine with us, although we know that this is a very ambitious target, especially for commercial vans. So the light commercial vehicles. I will come back on these, but the decision has not been transformed into a legal text, but the government is working as if this was already included in the law. So all the ministries are working very closely, and this was a big change compared to the past, to move forward towards this decision. And I will come back eventually at a later stage on a recent decision for incentives that we have taken recently. The second point, as you said, our report that is being translated in English based on the advice of our experts clearly says that for cars and also for light commercial vehicles, the electric solution is the best. not only in absolute terms, but also in relative terms. What I mean is that these reports take into account from motorcycles to planes, going through all the possible transport means. And although technologically speaking, and Italy is working also in this direction, the biofuel could be a good solution, at least for in some respects, for some of these different transport means. We have to take into account the overall picture. Therefore, beside discussing the technological solutions which are feasible for each and every car, motorcycles, and so on and so forth, we have to decide where to allocate the different systems for the different sections, let's say, or segments of this big transition that we have to make. What I mean is that, for example, for the biofuel solutions, our experts recommend to use them where there are no alternatives, in particular where there is no electric solution alternative, because we have to also balance the demand with the supply, which is feasible. So for the motorcycles, as I said, for cars, and also for light commercial vehicles, the recommendation is to go also following the low regrets principle, let's say, towards electric. For heavy trucks and other buses and so on, there was more discussion looking at also hydrogen and electric, of course, a solution. But we know that this decision cannot be just taken in isolation by one particular member country, because this kind of vehicles move around, and it is important that the European Union, and not only the European Union, allows these vehicles to move in a coherent way. Otherwise, there would be a big issue with the overall system of transport. Let me conclude in just saying that for the maritime transport and the air transport, the solutions are even more difficult to find, although for the air system, the synthetic fuels are the most feasible, or at least at this stage of technology, the most likely solution, let's say. But also in this case, we have to take into account the overall international landscape, while for the maritime sector, technologies are still discussing, let's say, among themselves. Let me put it in this way, because there is no clear solution that emerges. So this is, in a nutshell, the picture that emerged from this study that you mentioned. But even if in some cases the solutions are clearer than others, the implementation is equally difficult, and especially for those sectors where the technology that will be used is not so clearly defined at this stage.
So thank you very much, Enrico. And indeed, implementation is what we will come on to next. But before I go to that, let's just bring in Joan. Joan, can you hear me? I just want to make sure you can hear me.
Yeah, perfectly. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly. Thank you for joining us today. So we heard there about Italy's comprehensive report and indeed Germany's stance. In Spain, I understand the government has a big strategic project for electric vehicles known as PERTEVEC, correct me if I'm wrong, that has already sparked announcement from car makers who are hoping to be part of the transformation of Spain into an e-mobility hub. I know that's certainly what Volkswagen sees in Spain. How much of a game changer is this project for Spain's ambition for the EU CO2 targets? And do you think it will now support a 2035 phase out and ambitious intermediate targets?
So thank you very much for the event, by the way, and for the opportunity to take part in it. And I think it's quite an interesting few topics that to have on the table at the same time, actually. Indeed, we have the PERTEVEC on the table at the moment. This is to give a bit broader context to international colleagues following the event. For us in Spain, the Recovery and Resilience Plan, pretty similar to in the rest of Europe, I guess, is not about obviously bouncing back to a pre-COVID economy, but it's about building better. It's about transforming the economy at the same time as we recover it. And when we talk about the energy transition, obviously this means accelerating the energy transition, reducing dependence on fossil fuels, reducing external energy dependence. But it means doing that without increasing or generating new dependencies, such as technological or industrial dependencies, but rather strengthening Spain's and Europe's strategic autonomy when it comes to batteries, when it comes to engines, when it comes to electromobility in this case, but also other areas like renewables, like storage, or many others. So the idea basically that underpins all of this is building an energy transition which is designed and made in Europe, not just an energy transition which benefits Europe. So, and the idea behind the PERTE system is, PERTE is basically an acronym in Spanish, which basically stands for projects which are able to kickstart the recovery through transforming the economy. And that's exactly where this PERTEVEC fits, indeed, oriented towards electric and connected vehicles. One of the colleagues mentioned at the start that Spain is a big automotive country. It's one of the main car manufacturers in Europe, obviously a big part of the Spanish economy. It's calculated that up to 10% of Spain's GDP is directly or indirectly connected to the automotive sector. So obviously how that transformation happens, when it happens, and how those opportunities linked to the transformation to electromobility happen is crucial. Obviously it's linked to climate targets, but it's also linked to how basically the economic and the political system behind that is able to support this transformation. So the idea is that this PERTE will reinforce Spain's and Europe's strategic autonomy around electromobility, therefore make it easier for Spain and the EU to accelerate decarbonization. We have clear climate targets. We are fortunately defining the sort of intermediate or sectorial targets that we need in order to be able to meet our climate targets. But we need to make sure that the opportunities are there, but also that the public, that workers, that every single sector understands that those opportunities are there and that they are very visible. It's very difficult if we want to maintain traction, if we want to ensure that the energy transition is not something that happens sort of despite public opinion, but actually happens thanks to public opinion, or happens and is reinforced by public opinion, that people don't just see a number in 2035, 2040, 2030, but people start to understand, okay, what happens to my job tomorrow, and is able to visualize how their reality today can transform into a green reality or a carbon neutral, compatible reality very, very quickly. So the fact that we've been able to use part of the recovery funding to generate the interest of different automotive sector industries to kickstart or accelerate their investments in electromobility in Spain means that we can continue to make the energy transition something that is shared, that is understood, that is compatible, and we are able to push away sort of populist debates that, unfortunately, I think colleagues from other countries are seeing similar risks happening, where others might be interested in bringing in the discourse that the energy transition is somehow against jobs, against young people, or against the economy. I think we are able to prove that they go hand in hand, and the best way to do that is preparing for the future, having clear, ambitious targets. That's the only way we're going to actually construct, to build that future. And so going back to your question, obviously it's easier for, I would say not only Spain, but for Europe as a whole to accelerate on that track if we are able to link the energy transition, the transition in mobility, in electromobility in this case, with the technological, the industrial, the employment reality behind that. And for us, it was very, very important to link both things. The recent announcement by certain companies are very, very positive news for Spain, but I would say for Europe as a whole. And they are very encouraging for all of us to be able to continue on that road.
Yes, thank you. Joan, you mentioned there that it's very important to understand what's really behind the headline numbers and to explain what all of that means. And Christiane, if I can come back to you on this, Germany has actually put together some concrete figures. There's a national target of, I believe, getting 15 million fully electric cars on the road by the end of the decade. And Germany's also committed to being carbon neutral by 2045, which is, as many people know, 5 years earlier than the EU as a whole. So, Christiane, I mean, how important are the car CO2 targets for ensuring that these targets as a whole can be met? Do you think that they are enough? Does Germany need more ambitious targets in 2025? So interim targets in 2025 or 2027? For this to be achievable, for the 2030 and the 2045 deadlines to be achievable?
I think the CO2 targets will not be sufficient as the only mean to get to these targets that we have for ourselves, to get 15 million fully electric cars on the road by 2030. But I think the Commission's proposal is a product of a compromise within the European Commission. It sets a demanding long-term target that says from 2035 no more internal combustion engines in new cars and vans, and in return it doesn't impose any new short-term targets before 2030. And similarly, our position to these CO2 standards in the German government is also the result of a compromise. Our decision is to support the Commission proposal in all its elements. And this is also the product of a compromise within our government. I personally had preferred higher CO2 standards, especially more ambitious short-term targets, but this is key of a compromise that's a meeting in between. In return, we support 100% zero-emission cars from 2035, which sends a strong signal and is a really essential step for achieving full climate neutral mobility by 2050. But I think we also have to do more to reach the 15 million fully electric cars. And for example, we also support if you buy a fully electric car. So this is also one other element. And I think that especially in Germany, there are some producers that also have set themselves quite higher standards for the short term than it's in the Commission's proposal at the moment.
Thank you, Christiane. Enrico, talking about the interim targets that are needed there. So I believe according to data that's published by Motus E, which is an Italian platform for electro mobility, there are less than 300,000 electrified cars currently in the Italian fleet. And at the same time, the Italian government has set a national target of, I believe, 6 million EVs by 2030 in its National Energy and Climate Plan. So firstly, do you think Italy is on track to meet this ambitious target? And would an EU sort of 2027 intermediate target for cars and vans, together with a more ambitious perhaps target for 2030, help Italy meet this commitment, and what is your ministry doing to help meet this commitment?
Well, the point is that this change, the process that is taking us through this big change, I think is highly nonlinear. Therefore, it would be very difficult to set targets, intermediate targets, without knowing exactly how the market and people's behaviors would react to changes in policies. Indeed, Italy is late compared to other countries, both for the recharge systems around the country, but also in terms of new cars that have been bought by people, but. And here, the but is really about what our government is trying to do. First of all, let me say that Italy came out of a very severe recession due to COVID-19, and notwithstanding the big recovery in 2021, we, together with other countries, are facing a very uncertain economic time. Is a moment in which a lot of people, beside companies, are just increasing their savings because of uncertainty about the future. In other words, this moment is not necessarily the moment in which people will run to buy new cars in general, but to influence the decision that anyway some people are taking and will be taking. The government has established a new fund. It's 1 billion euro from 2023 onwards and 700 million euros for this year, in order to support both the demand and the supply of electric cars. Not only electric cars from the demand side, because unfortunately Italy has a very old fleet, let's say, one of the oldest in Europe, but also to support the move towards electric cars, electric motorcycles, and electric light commercial vehicles. We have decided also to support the supply in order to strengthen our capacity of producing new generation cars, electric cars inside Italy, using the very, I would say, really first-class production chain we have in our country, which is serving other countries, such as Germany, for example. And again, I believe that this is a really non-linear process. And let me add from this point of view that this non-linearity is also due to other policies that we are putting in place to push people to go back quickly on public transport, first of all, that was largely reduced in terms of usage during the COVID-19. This is why, among other things, we have just established a fund to cut down the cost of the tickets, and in particular the annual tickets for buses and trams and other public transport systems, similarly to what Germany has done. But we will implement this in the second half of this year, also to check the availability of people to react to price changes. In the past, the elasticity to the cost of tickets was quite low in the Italian experience, but we believe that in these particular circumstances, the elasticity will be much higher. And this is particularly important because our efforts in the National Recovery and Resilience Plan is to stimulate a lot the public mobility, sustainable public mobility systems in order to really have a big shift and having less mobility in future by private cars for reducing not only CO2 emissions, but also the pollution in our cities. So as you can see, there isn't a single silver bullet, as we say in English, that we are putting our fish on, but we believe that just the complementarity and an holistic set of policies can help in making this change, helping our country to reach the target fixed at 2030.
And Enrico, you mentioned there is no silver bullet there, but these schemes that you outlined together, are they enough for you to catch up? You mentioned Italy is late. Is it enough in their totality combined to get you to 6 million by 2030?
This is our expectation, but as I said, we have to speed up also on the recharge batteries systems. So we needed to go together, hand in hand, the demand side and also the infrastructure side, because otherwise people will buy cars and get crazy to find a recharge point. That wouldn't be very helpful for the transition in the next years.
Indeed. Joan, if I can come to you, we talked about Germany's target is 15 million, Italy's is 6 million EVs by 2030. Spain, I think, is 5 million by 2030. Firstly, is the country on track to meet this objective? And does this plan need to be revised, especially now, perhaps we need more ambitious targets in the wake of the crisis that we're going through when it comes to fossil fuels?
So I think my colleague from Italy, Enrico, raised a really interesting point, which is the fact of it's how non-linear basically the uptake of any new technology is, but in this case, electric vehicles. And if you look at the numbers, Spain, the number of registration of new vehicles, electric vehicles were around 2 to 3% the year before last. They were around 5% of new vehicles last year. They're above 10% this year. So multiplying by 2 pretty much every year, despite the COVID situation. And so it's extremely difficult to have a proper prediction of what things are going to look like in around 10 years' time. I think there's a common message there from Spain, from Italy, and maybe other Southern European countries. We are behind our Northern European neighbors and Central European neighbors. That is true. Part of that is to do with GDP and purchasing power. I mean, we are still talking, unfortunately, about vehicles which have a slight cost premium compared to internal combustion engine vehicles, despite subsidies or despite the fact that in terms of use and whole life of use of the vehicles, it's already probably cheaper to use electric vehicles if you take into account fuel and charging and so on. But the initial purchasing, there's a difference there, and you need to take purchasing power into account. And then there's an issue to do with geography probably and cultural issues. So even though over 90% of car travel in Spain is for relatively short distances, it's within the same municipality, there would be no issues whatsoever when it comes to range and the range capacity of current battery electric vehicles. People often make their purchasing decision based on that one time a year or 2 times a year when they go to a second home or when they visit relatives in the other part of the country. And as you know, Spain is quite a large country, so chances are that people live very far away from their parents or their children or their family. And unfortunately, people make the decision based on that one time that they're going to make that trip. So there's cultural, economic, technical issues there to take into account. But having said that, I think, honestly, the signals are very encouraging. As I was saying, that the percentage of electric vehicle registrations are multiplying by 2 every year. we're also seeing that it's slowing down, but what I hear from the sector is this is as much to do from the supply side as the demand side. There's an issue, as you know, with microprocessors and the supply chain itself. So there's a slight limitation there, which is affecting the market. So that the curve maybe isn't growing as fast as it should, but it's not only sort of the demand, there's also an issue there from the supply. And so we need to obviously monitor the situation carefully and analyze what happens when going forwards. You mentioned the current oil and gas crisis. And I think it's interesting because obviously that makes both companies and people start to become more conscious of costs and try to be more, have more caution when it comes to any expenditure at all. People become more conservative, economically speaking, in situations of crisis. But what we are also seeing is that the increase in the price of petrol and diesel at gas stations, in the same way as the increase in the price of electricity, is also helping people make that sort of mental change and starting to realize, okay, I thought, this whole electric vehicle thing or solar panels or energy renovation was very expensive. Actually, maybe it's not so expensive when I see the alternative. So we are also seeing that the current crisis obviously means that governments have to accelerate measures, but it also means that citizens, that companies are seeing that business case for making that change. And that's very interesting. We're starting to see that in social debate, in political debate. Very similar to what Italy and Germany and other countries are working on. I think for us, it's both obviously subsidies to support people purchasing electric vehicles and purchasing charging infrastructure. But we are also bringing in, like other European countries, measures such as low emission zones in cities. We are seeing that makes an impact. For example, the city of Madrid was the first to bring in a large low emission zone in Spain. And we are seeing that has an impact on the proportion of vehicles, of clean vehicles that are bought in the Madrid city compared to the rest of Spain. We also see, obviously, that the availability of charging infrastructure is very important for electromobility. Regions like the Balearic Islands in Spain, they have a very high proportion of charging infrastructure, and we see the statistics there increasing accordingly. And an issue that's also as important as having the charging infrastructure is knowing that it's there. It's not only being able to charge, it's knowing that you will be able to charge, to be able to deal with what we call range anxiety. And before the summer, so in the next month or so, Spain will have an official map, which includes every single publicly available charging point available to anyone to use. And obviously any private operators, they can import that map into their own platforms or their own maps. And so we will realize that in Spain, we already have way more charging infrastructure available than petrol stations, for example. And obviously nobody in Spain says that, oh, maybe we don't have enough diesel or gas stations. However, we have a lot more charging infrastructure available in Spain. We just don't know about it. Obviously, if you're not an electric vehicle user, it's unlikely that you will know about it. So that the information part for the consumers, it's also very, very important. In terms of how that links to updating our targets, as the rest of European countries, every few years we have to upgrade our energy and climate plan. We are currently working on analyzing how the COVID situation first, and currently the current energy situation is affecting the energy system right now, but also the view for the next few years. And so in our next update, obviously, this is something that we will take into account. As I said, other positive things that come out of crisis situations, such as people realizing that change is sometimes better than business as usual.
Indeed. Joan, we're completely out of time. In fact, we're over time, but I just very quickly wanted to ask you, and I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, but in one line, given all of those cultural issues that you've outlined, do you expect Spain to back the 2035 phase out? And do you expect the 2030 ambition to be reached, given all that you've mentioned, just in one line?
So I think it was said earlier, I think every single member state is able to back that target if there's enough consensus. Our own Spanish legislation set a 2040 target compatible with the current targets. But what we said in the legislation is we will adapt this target to whatever happens at the European level. So obviously we're very happy to go with that, and therefore accelerate our ambition in the short and midterm to be able to meet that 2035 target.
Marvelous. Well, thanks for clarifying that at the end. And as I mentioned, we're completely out of time. Lots more to discuss, but only remains for me to thank our panel, Christiane, Enrico, and Joan. Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned because we are moving swiftly on to our very next panel, which is entitled, When is the right time for business, workers and consumers to go fully electric? And with us today, we have Stuart Rowley, who's the chair of Ford Europe, which needs no introduction, I hope. Christelle Kelf, who is the Deputy Secretary General of CFDT FGMM, and the FGMM is the CFDT Federation that represents workers in the automotive industry, the CFDT being the leading trade union organization in France. A quick note that Christelle will be speaking in French. So if you are watching online, you want to make sure that you are getting a translation in your own language. And I'm going to put on a headset here, which will give me translation as well. We have Sylvia Maurer, who's Director of Sustainability at the EUC, the European Consumer Organization, which for those of you aren't familiar, is the umbrella group for 46 independent consumer organizations from 32 countries across Europe. And we have Brian Palmer, who's head of public policy, EU last mile at Amazon. And it won't surprise you to know that Amazon is obviously one of the biggest electric fleet owners in Europe. And we're waiting for a representative of Iberdrola, who I believe, Augustine, marvelous, who's going to join us in just one moment. Augustine Delgado, who's Chief Innovation and Sustainability Officer at Iberdrola. Welcome, Augustine. Perhaps you could take a seat over here to my left. Bear with me, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just going to put this headset on. Great. Okay, marvelous. So thank you all for joining us. Stuart, if perhaps we could start with you. Can you hear me? I can see.
Yes.
Marvelous.
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. As many people will be aware that Ford has one of the, well, I would say was one of the forerunners with its electrification plans in Europe, one of the industry's forerunners. Could you tell us a little bit about your plans for electrification in Europe and your view on the 2035 proposal? Do you think it's feasible, and how will Ford get there?
Yeah, thank you, Joe, and thank you for inviting me to join the panel. So, yes, Ford in Europe, we've made our decision. We communicated back in March of this year. In fact, we communicated in February of last year that all of our passenger vehicles would be zero emissions capable by 26, and that from 2030 we would only sell zero emission passenger vehicles. And then in March of this year, we communicated that in addition, all of our commercial vehicles would be zero emission vehicle sales by 2035. And for Ford, we have our iconic Transit family of vehicles. That's a very important part of our business. So we've made the decision that by 2035, we'll be EV only. And then globally as a company, we also announced in March that we formed a dedicated business unit, Ford Model E, a team within Ford that will drive this transition focused on not only electric vehicles, but on the embedded software and the connectivity that will really differentiate those vehicles for consumers. So we've made the decision. Our key focus now, having made that decision, of course, is this needs to be a partnership, not only from OEMs such as ourselves, but our customers to have the ongoing increased demand for these vehicles need to be able to use them. They need to be able to have confidence that they will be able to use these products, just as efficiently and effectively as they have a combustion engine vehicle. And there we have a huge job ahead of us. We're a part of that, but particularly with governments and other partners to build out the infrastructure and the pace of that infrastructure build out is not on track today. It needs to be dramatically accelerated if we're to have an environment by 2035 when all OEMs could be zero emissions only, and that consumers can have the confidence to be able to use those products. So we've taken really a yes and approach to this. We're all in. We need to work now with governments at the European level, but also at the national and local level, because this comes down to planning permission to put in place chargers, on-street parking, high-speed charging, all of its forms, so that we can have this infrastructure in place.
Thank you, Stuart. Very clear there on the infrastructure part of the equation, which I'm sure will be a topic we talk about quite a bit today. Christelle, if I can bring you in here, I hope you can hear me. Thank you for joining us today. We hear a lot about the transition and what it means for the auto industry. We heard that from Stuart just now, that people need to be able to use the electric cars that they buy. But we don't hear that much often from the workers' perspective. How do you then see this transition and this technological shift impacting the workers in the car industry, and what is the future of the workers in this sector?
Oui, bonjour à tous et à toutes. Tout d'abord, au nom de la fédération FG2M CFDT, nous tenions à vous remercier pour votre invitation à cet événement, à cette table ronde. Donc, pour répondre à cette interrogation, comment nous voyons la mutation technologique de l'industrie automobile et son avenir du point de vue des travailleurs, en fait, les réalités de la filière automobile varient d'un pays à un autre, que ce soit en Europe ou dans le monde. Donc, entre des pays qui sont devenus des terres d'industrie de l'automobile, comme en Europe de l'Est, par exemple, ou encore la France, qui est le pays d'Europe qui a perdu le plus d'emplois, avec 100 000 emplois perdus, et cela sur une quinzaine d'années. La situation, vous le comprenez, de départ et d'arrivée est forcément différente. Donc, les enjeux de la mobilité zéro carbone doivent s'apprécier en fonction des technologies montantes et descendantes. Qu'est-ce qu'on entend par montante et descendante en termes de technologie? Donc, pour les technologies montantes, on peut s'intéresser aux batteries, moteurs électriques, aux convertisseurs, mais aussi au software, par exemple, ou au traitement des données. Pour ce qui est des technologies descendantes, on parlera plutôt de ce qui est autour du groupe moto-propulseur, comme par exemple les motorisations à combustion interne, les transmissions, les circuits d'alimentation en carburant. Et la chaîne d'assemblage, elle aussi, est réinterrogée, car on n'assemble pas une voiture électrique avec autant de ressources qu'un modèle thermique ou hybride. Il faut aussi rajouter pour nous les effets induits par le passage de l'usine 4.0 sur les emplois, que ce soit en qualification ou en quantitatif. Pour la CFDT, la mutation technologique va se faire avec une diminution des emplois, ça c'est clair, mais avec une adaptation des compétences aux nouvelles technologies. Nous devons donc avoir une attitude responsable et assumer cette transition. L'avenir de l'automobile sera vert, sinon l'automobile n'aura pas d'avenir comme tout le reste de l'humanité d'ailleurs. Réussir cette mutation est une obligation au regard des générations futures. La CFDT prône une mise à plat et un partage des informations afin de donner plus de visibilité possible aux acteurs de la filière au niveau national et au niveau européen. De réaliser des conférences sociales multisecteurs, en région au plus près des établissements qui seront concernés par ces fins de vie de pièces et composants, de recentrer les plaques de production avec un taux d'intégration le plus proche des 100%. La filière automobile, pour nous, a un avenir que nous devons construire en intégrant les offres multimodales de mobilité et une plus grande sobriété avec moins de véhicules et plus de personnes transportées. Pour nous, une durabilité plus importante, incluant dans tout cela une approche économie circulaire. Donc voilà ce que je pouvais vous répondre sur cette question.
Thank you very much, Christelle. One moment, let me turn down my own interpretation. You talked about the future being, all of us working together, and Stuart there mentioned the need for infrastructure, which brings me on neatly to Augustine. Thank you very much for being with us here in person. I should have said earlier, obviously, Iberdrola, for those not familiar, is a massive multinational energy company, electricity utility company headquartered here in Spain, which is why you able to join us in person today. But with regards to that need to work together, what are Iberdrola's commitments on clean energy? How do you see the future of clean mobility? How do you fit into this picture? Perhaps give us an overview. And you have to press the little button over there to speak. Perfect.
Well, thank you for inviting me to share our thoughts on this matter. Well, first, for sure, we as energy companies, we have not taken care of, let's say, demand in the past. So we had consumers that demanded us different energy products, being electricity or being natural gas or some others, and we really focus on supplying what the demand wanted. But the truth is that the social needs has changed, and the need for the different energy products also has changed. And it is not only the need for the energy, but this energy need to have different attributes. So for sure, it has to be competitive. We all know that we cannot have a sustainable energy if it's not competitive. It has to be, let's say, environmentally friendly, climate change, but also biodiversity. And it also need to ensure the security of supply. And well, the technology has allowed our companies to start developing these products. And they used to be different. Well, there are three sectors for the demand of energy: mobility, residential, industry, and there are some sectors that somehow were forbidden for this kind of products, like mobility, that it's really addicted to liquefied hydrocarbons, or some kind of industry, like high temperature industry, that are also very dependent on carbon. If we talk about mobility, now society, for example, cities, request mobility to be done in a different way, with no emissions, and also in a competitive way. So we as energy companies want to really influence the demand by offering them a different product that they are not used to it, like in the case of mobility, like electric vehicles and electricity. And so we are learning and we are developing all the different things that are needed for the customers to embrace this new mobility or these new products. And well, we have, for example, we need to supply green electricity to the customers, and we can ensure them with this. We need to supply competitive energy to the customers, so the cost is low. For example, we can offer our electric vehicle customers time of use tariff from 1 a.m. to 7 a.m. That is only 3 cents per kilowatt hour, 30 euros per megawatt hour. This means around €1 per 100 kilometers if you charge your car at that time. We offer them also the technology to charge their car at home, enabling them to have it and making it easy for them. And we are also developing the infrastructure to charge their car if they have a long trip. So, in a nutshell, we are decided to change some of these sectors and to bring this green electricity a competitive way, in a competitive manner, with security of supply, to the mobility. And maybe we can talk about that later on a bit deeper, but this is what we are planning.
Yes, thank you very much. Perhaps we will get onto that if time allows. Sylvia, I wonder if I can come to you. Firstly, thank you for joining us. Augustine mentioned there how important it is to put the consumer at the heart of this and trying to make life easier for those transitioning to the electric world. You spend your time representing, European consumers. I wonder whether you think from a consumer perspective that the EU policy is right to essentially mandate what technologies can be used from a certain date. Some would say that this restricts choice. And do you think perhaps that the regulation should be based instead on neutrality, technologically, open, and allowing consumers to make the choice instead?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks to Transport and Environment for inviting us to this discussion. Well, let me first say that electric driving can drastically reduce costs for consumers. And BEOC just had today its General Assembly where we met with all our members across Europe. And it's very obvious that for members, consumers organizations at the moment, the question about the crisis in Ukraine and the inflation and the increase of energy costs is a very predominant topic. And we have therefore actually been happy that the European Parliament's Environment Committee has underlined the importance that combustion engines must be phased out by 2035. We have also been a little bit disappointed that there has not yet been a political decision that we also need a very clear plan with interim targets. We should have a target for 2027 and also strengthen targets for 2030 to really have this clear plan. From our perspective, there is no alternative at the moment to going carbon neutral with having this forward-looking clear schedule for everyone, because the transition, we have heard it before, is huge and the challenges are enormous. From my perspective, let me say the debate has not so much to do with the debate around technological neutrality or restricting consumer choice. We need to see what is happening on the market. A lot of car companies are declaring now that they want to contribute to this change and maybe even be quicker than the official targets. And consumer demand, we have also heard that before in the debate, for e-vehicles is increasing. So for me, it's more a question, can the industry also meet consumers' demand and follow the legislative requirements? The legislation must set the pathway here. I think that's our most important point. We are not surprised that more and more consumers are also interested in getting an electric vehicle, because we have calculated through different total cost of ownership studies that electric driving is the best and most cost-effective solution for consumers. Of course, we need to look into it in a differentiated way, but that we can maybe also still discuss during this panel. From our studies, what we see, and we have been doing them in several European countries, the cost argument is very clear here towards the electric vehicles.
Yes, thank you, Sylvia. And I think that's certainly consumer demand, and consumer demand for electric vehicles is one of the things that surprised the industry. On the upside, so to speak, people seem to have a larger appetite for EVs than previously assumed. Brian, I wondered if I could come to you talking about consumers and consumer demand. There's a lot of consumer demand for products to be energy efficient as well. And I believe that Amazon has pledged that half of its deliveries will be carbon neutral by 2030. I wondered, first of all, if you could tell us what that means with regards to your fleet and the electrification of your fleet. Presumably that plays a rather big role. And what role do the EU standards we're discussing today play in you delivering that objective?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me and for inviting Amazon to participate on such an important issue. And thank you to Transport and Environment for your leadership in this space. I think it's most useful to take a step back and discuss how we think about climate change writ large and how we're approaching this problem. Amazon aims to be Earth's most customer-centric company, so I'm glad that my fellow panelists have brought up the issue of the end customer. But what we know our customers want to see in this space is us to do our part and us to lead on climate change and on sustainable operating practices. And that's what drove Amazon in 2019 to develop and co-found the Climate Pledge, which will bring us to net zero carbon across all of our operations by 2040, 10 years ahead of the Paris Accords. And part of that, I'm glad you raised shipment zero. Shipment zero is our vision to make 50% of all Amazon packages, all Amazon deliveries, net zero carbon by 2030. And there's a lot more there than just fleet electrification, although I'm happy to touch on that point in a minute. But shipment zero is really a holistic view. So the full life cycle of the package, it requires us to take a really deep, difficult look at our supply chain, at our efficiency practices, and at decarbonization. Where that leads us in the last mile is the deployment of electric vans. Amazon is proudly stepping up in this space with our commitment to buy and deploy 100,000 electric vans from Rivian. That was the largest commercial order for electric vehicles in history. And they'll be deployed alongside our existing electric vehicle fleet from excellent manufacturing partners like Mercedes, like our friends at Ford. And already we're seeing the benefits of moving in this direction. This is what customers want to see. And in Europe, last year alone, we delivered over 100 million packages by electric vehicle across the continent. Now, you mentioned, how does this play into shipment zero? Well, Amazon is stubborn on vision, but flexible on how we get there. So we are stubborn on pursuing zero carbon transportation modes and mechanisms, but that means electric vehicles as much as it means things like micromobility, e-scooters or cargo bikes. What we believe the role of, you mentioned EU regulation, and I'm glad you brought that up. What we believe the role there is that we need to see, and we hope that the European Union will continue to take this leadership role. We need to see a bold signal to investors, to manufacturers of equipment, to infrastructure providers, as I'm glad that folks here have raised that this is the direction that we're headed, that electric vehicles are the clearest zero emission solution. So when we see, for example, the CO2 standards on heavy duty vehicles, which we recently supported a more ambitious target of 50% reduction by 2030, or when we see the alternative fuel infrastructure regulation, or AFIR, we're hugely supportive of, and we applaud the European Union for taking these bold steps. We need to see more of this kind of leadership. And we look forward to working with the folks at T&E and the folks on this panel on making this electric zero emission future a reality.
Thank you, Brian. Interesting insights in how sometimes the industry or industries can be leading regulation in the right direction on this. Stuart, if I could come back to you, I wanted to ask you a couple of things. Firstly, on the subject of synthetic fuels when it comes to the decarbonisation of transport, sort of subject that keeps on coming back up. We hear certain manufacturers discounting their use and saying that they're not a solution, and then every now and then we see another commitment to e-fuels. So firstly, do you think that synthetic fuels and e-fuels could be a part of the solution as well? And secondly, the electric cars more, generally much more expensive than conventional models. And I wondered whether you think that can come down soon. There's a lot of talk about that happening in the middle of the decade. And when will there be a sort of affordable, entry segment electric vehicle?
Yes, well, thank you, Joe. On the first point about synthetic fuels, we do not see those as an alternative to full battery electric vehicles. There may be a role for synthetic fuels to play, for example, in use of the significant park that will exist for a long time of internal combustion engine vehicles, but also the volume of availability of synthetic fuels is probably going to be limited for some time and maybe better deployed in other non-automotive applications, for example, aviation, other applications where other alternatives are not available. So I think they'll be a part of an overall mix, but certainly not a alternative to electrification. On the subject of cost, I think the automotive industry and Ford Motor Company, right back to our founder Henry Ford, have been at the leading edge of driving cost efficiency into the products that we create and that we build. And we're on that journey. There's a lot of speculation about when the cost lines will cross over. And that is different already today. Another of your contributors talked about the total cost of ownership, which can already be favorable depending upon the use case of the vehicle. But it'll also be driven by a number of other factors, particularly around battery costs, battery chemistries, and raw materials. You've recently, as I'm sure your listeners are aware, we've seen a significant spike in all raw material costs, but including key raw materials that go into battery production. So we've actually seen costs go up most recently. But that said, we and all of the industry participants are working this. We're working on improved manufacturing methods. We're working on different battery chemistries. We're scaling those products. We're investing deeper into the supply chain for raw materials, all the way back to raw material extraction. So this will be an ongoing journey. I don't know the date that the lines will cross, but I think they will, and you will progressively see more affordable products come to the market to serve consumers.
And does the rest of the industry accelerating help you get to that target, the economies of scale across the industry? Does that help you?
Yes, I think it does. And you already see in the supply base, the automotive supply base, suppliers are concentrating their investments in these new technologies. As I talked about our decision at Ford, we will not make ICE vehicles beyond 2035. And of course, the supply base understands that. They prioritize their capital for where they see consumers and original equipment manufacturers like ourselves going. So there's a lot of capital going into this. There's a lot of investment in R&D in an industry that, for 100+ years has driven cost efficiency in an extremely competitive manner, both in Europe and globally.
Indeed. Thank you, Stuart. Christelle, if I can come back to you. Stuart mentioned driving cost efficiencies, and often those cost efficiencies been driven down to the suppliers who are the large employers. You mentioned some of the challenges there for workers. What would be your position then concretely on the Commission's target for all new cars to be zero emission from 2035? From the workers' perspective, what would be your position on that specific target?
Alors, dans un rapport commun avec Fondation Nature et l'Homme, Syndex et puis la Fédération, donc la FG2M CFDT, dans laquelle on a étudié plusieurs scénarios pour une transition juste dans la filière groupe moto-propulseur, nous avons acté l'arrêt des motorisations thermiques dès 2030, avec un 100% véhicule électrique en 2035, comme hypothèse de base de nos préconisations pour les années à venir. La CFDT est donc en ligne avec les propositions de la Commission européenne, considérant qu'il est nécessaire d'être dans l'anticipation pour espérer atteindre les objectifs en matière de décarbonation. quand bien même tous les scénarios que nous avons pu étudier mettaient en évidence une perte d'emploi sur les 5 à 10 ans à venir au périmètre de la construction automobile, mais aussi des services autour de l'automobile, dont l'entretien des véhicules et la distribution de carburant, par exemple. Les leçons que nous avons tirées du précédent épisode de la norme CAF sont que la filière automobile n'évolue que sous la contrainte et l'exigence. Certes, il y a encore aujourd'hui des tentatives de faire reculer les échéances, de fin des motorisations à combustion interne en repoussant à 2040 la fin des véhicules hybrides, ou encore à demander des adaptations, comme cela a été le cas pour la minoration du poids introduite dans le calcul des objectifs CO2, et qui fait que plus on est lourd, plus on a le droit de polluer, ou encore ceux qui demandent des exceptions pour des marchés de niche ou des e-carburants. Alors pour nous, c'est aujourd'hui qu'il faut être contraignant. Et aujourd'hui, il n'y a pas de meilleure voie pour le climat que d'aller plus vite, plus haut, plus fort. Plus vite, car il ne reste que 3 ans pour agir durablement. Plus haut, car il faut avoir des réponses à la hauteur de l'ambition. Plus fort, car l'action individuelle ne suffira pas. Voilà la position de la CFDT.
Thank you, Christelle. Aim higher, Augustine, is what Christelle said there. 1 minute, let me just turn down the translation again. One of the problems with aiming higher is whether all parts of this equation will be ready. And there are quite a lot of concerns out there that the infrastructure, indeed, you know, the energy infrastructure won't be ready for such a quick ramp up. What's seeing you support the phase out in 2035? Do you think that the system, the infrastructure will be ready for such a massive increase in electric vehicles in Europe?
I do believe so. I do believe so. First, we have to distinguish very well between, well, first light-duty vehicles and then heavy-duty vehicles. Let's start with light-duty vehicles. In light-duty vehicles, first, it is about charging at home, right? So the standard, the average distance that a Spanish citizen, European citizen drives per day, it's 50 kilometers, around 50 kilometers. This means that you only need 10 kilowatts hour average per day, right? And if you have a 3 kilowatt connection at home, you only need 3 hours to charge your car for your average day. I'm talking about average, right? So this is what the system need to stand. So this is nothing. This is like turning on the air conditioning when it's hot, or turning the. So the electric system has this capacity before. First thing. Second thing. The electric vehicles are much more efficient. So the need for energy, in total energy, is much less than internal combustion engine. Another thing, it is that the need for power to charge those electric vehicles, we expect to be not too significant. Why? Because, as you know, electric vehicles, most of them are deferrable loads. It's sad, or it's true to say that electric vehicles, light-duty electric vehicles, are usually stopped. We don't use our cars as much, so they are usually stopped. So you can really charge your car when the price is better, or when you don't need to use all the power for your oven or whatever. So it's true that probably we will have to make some reinforcement in some places, but what we have found so far, it is that there is no problem about infrastructure. So this is in the residential side. Look, so let's talk now about highways. When you are going to have a travel, what do you do in highways? First thing, usually when you do a traveling, your car is fully charged. This is not the same with internal combustion engines. But when you are going to have a travel to my home place in Extremadura, Trujillo, nice city, you will for sure ensure that your car is fully charged. So the need for energy in the traveling is not that high or as high as it used to be in internal combustion engines. Well, you will find that you will need to put charging stations not at 100 kilometers from the big cities, but probably at 300 kilometers or 400 kilometers when the car that has been fully charged at home needs to be recharged again. So the need for infrastructure is much less. But another thing, every single plug that there is in a restaurant, in a mall, in everywhere is a charging pole, a charging station. So imagine how many of them we have, and you can find that there is many charging stations that are being placed in many of these sites. Like for example, just an example from Iberdrola, we have signed an agreement with McDonald's to be McDonald's a charging station. You don't need a specific oil station to charge your car. A restaurant is a place that is very good, a mall is very good, and so forth. So this is what I see. I see that we have enough infrastructure, and that we can ramp up very easily if the electric cars are needed. And we have seen that in places like Norway, it has been done easily, and people is happy with it. If you wish for another question, we can talk about heavy duty vehicles that I also believe will be electric, and the thing about infrastructure is a bit different.
Yeah, indeed, a totally different picture for heavy duty. Thank you for that, Christine. Sylvia, we're running out of time, but I wonder if I can come to you for one more question. I was mentioning in my question to Stuart that, of course, electric cars are still largely more expensive than combustion engine models. And at the center of this is consumer decisions. So can consumers afford to make this a transition? And I suppose my question is, can they afford to make this transition? And if not, what can policymakers do to help make it more affordable?
Yes, indeed. I mean, cars are a very important investment for consumers, and they might think twice now that prices go up, and that's why a lot of consumers do not buy new cars. We have therefore showed in our total cost of ownership studies that the electric cars are in particular interesting for those who buy on the second or third hand market and for regular and heavy drivers. And these studies are not, like a Brussels-based view on the EU that uses some average cost calculations that we would apply across the EU. We really have done that per country, taking into account national varying factors, and there were very different countries in our study. I think if the electric cars will become the norm for everyone and quick, including for company cars in the public sector, car rental companies, you drive this market for second-hand vehicles. And policymakers can help that process very much by being ambitious on the target and setting this timeline very clear, as I mentioned before. Because the faster the electric cars are sold who can afford them as a first-hand owner, the quicker they can also travel on to the middle-income people that will benefit then financially through lower running and driving costs. But I also want to make the point that consumers are not only paying with their money, they are also partly paying with inconvenience. And there we need really to make sure that this transition will not be a big disappointment for them. And we therefore need a whole ecosystem around electric cars with more and convenient charging stations, easy payment by credit cards. So this is all like that you need to build to make sure people are not disappointed about this transition. And maybe we need even also a wider supply of smaller and more affordable electric city cars, and not only electrification in the premium segment, because that's where you can make most of the money at the moment. We may need to support consumers with targeted incentives, not only purchase subsidized, but also think about other financing schemes, tax cuts, for example, for the installation of charging points at home. That may be necessary, but as I said, if there's one thing I want to make clear, it's we need this legislation to be clear to stimulate that market and reach the economies of scale to make that transition. If it drags on for long, it will be more painful for consumers.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. And the point that you make about the need for the ecosystem to be there is one that seems to be shared by most of our panelists today. So good to emphasize that. We've run out of time once again with lots still to discuss. So we'll have to do this again sometime. But just remains for me to thank our panel, Stuart, Christelle, Augustine, Sylvia, and Brian. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panel. Now, just before we go on to our next panel, we'll have a 2-minute comfort break and be back very shortly. Right. I think we are ready to resume. I know I can be heard here in the room, just checking I'm good to go on the live stream. All good. Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for bearing with us. Without further ado, let me introduce the third and final panel today on how sustainable are EV batteries and their supply chains. And hopefully we've got with us Four wonderful panelists: Benoit Lemignon, who's CEO of Vercors, which is a French company that develops and produces batteries for electric vehicles. We should have with us as well Virginie Dechassé, who's Chief Sustainability and External Affairs Officer at Eramet, which is a French multinational mining and metallurgy company present in 20 countries worldwide also. We have Julia Poliskanova, Transport and Environment's own Senior Director of Vehicles and E-Mobility. And finally, we have Emma Nerenheim, Chairperson on the board of Hydrovolt, which is a joint venture between the Swedish battery manufacturer Northvolt and the Norwegian energy and aluminium company Hydro, which aims to deliver sustainable battery recycling in Europe. Welcome to you all. Benoit, if you can hear me, I'd like to start with you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I cannot. I think you cannot see me because you need to.
It's all right. I'm not much to look at. As long as you can hear me, that's all right. I want to start with you then. Critics of electric cars, they very often point to the talking point is that there is an embedded carbon and CO2 footprint to batteries, and they claim that therefore the zero emissions tag isn't quite accurate. How do you think about this when it comes to your batteries and their carbon footprint, and what can you do? What are the tools that you can use to reduce the carbon footprint of your batteries?
Well, thank you for the invitation and being here on stage with you, and great hi to all the listeners. I think those critics are somehow absolutely relevant. I mean, there is no or very little human activities that can be labeled as being a zero emission activity. So indeed, producing a battery, producing an electric vehicle is probably far from being zero emission, but and this is one of the reasons of launching this venture and joining the forces of the entrepreneurs in Europe to accelerate electrification, is that we are offering a solution to divide by a factor of 3 to 5 the impact of driving a car in Europe when it comes to the carbon dioxide emissions. So that said, the reduction of emissions of the production of the battery is very important, as is also the reduction of the emissions of the use phase of the car, because you all know that if you drive an EV that is using electricity produced by coal, the impact would be, of course, less important than if this electricity has been produced by hydro and potentially also nuclear when you look at the climate impact. So when it comes to what do we do specifically, first of all, we monitor what is happening, and this is not done in every industry. And you know that the battery industry, and I think Emma will certainly also reflect on that, has quite a complex upstream value chain. It goes down to first minings and refining, and then transformation into pre-CAM, CAM when it comes to the CAM material, which is in itself a value chain that is progressively entering the era of being able to share the reality of the impacts, which is not a given. We have been regularly asking all those partners and players in this value chain to make sure that we have the right information to be able to share that internally, but also with our customers and also with the general public. And this is the first effort that the industry is engaged into, is really to be able to understand what is happening, and then to address the points one by one to really lower the impact, because the ambition is to be able to serve the market with cleaner batteries that will answer the global challenges. So maybe to end on that, what we are currently doing is a mixed approach of securing the supply, because you can go fully clean, but sometimes the product that simply doesn't exist. Make sure also we have the right ESG standards, so it comes to carbon impact and we are reducing it very importantly, but also how sustainable is that in terms of local impact. And you certainly know that in some places, for example, in Chile, we have what issue with the water. If we go to Africa, in some countries, we have issues with some labor that we would not be able to really support. And the final topic is whether all that will come with a price and will come with a cost story, and how the customer is happy and ready to bear some part of this extra cost, because of course some producers are understanding that being low carbon has a value and has a cost and potentially has a price. This is the way we approach it, because we believe it's a nonsense to go EV if we are not proud and able to really make a difference in that sense. But I could speak for hours, so I will leave the floor for others to share their views.
Yes, thank you, Benoit. You mentioned there's a complex value chain, and indeed a lot to go into, and making that value chain, keeping that value chain sustainable is perhaps the biggest challenge right now. Virginie, if I can come to you, the picture at the moment is perhaps even more complicated than it was, say, a year ago. We've seen lithium prices; they've been soaring over the last few months, and there's increasing concerns that there just isn't enough capacity, enough raw materials for the EV ambitions that the industry and indeed regulators have. And then, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has complicated matters in the supply chain, and other prices like nickel have skyrocketed. So I suppose, how do you at Eramet see the availability of raw materials going forward? How quickly can we get the supplies that we need? I know you have a project in Argentina, for example, but how quickly and how viable is this supply chain, and how quickly can it be ramped up?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. You're absolutely right. All electrical recharging circuits, such as batteries for EV, require metals. Both price and demands are currently soaring. A standard lithium-ion battery for electric vehicles is composed of about 45 kilo of nickel, 40 kilo of lithium, and 6 kilo of cobalt. So you can imagine the needs that we're going to have. Let's focus 1 second on nickel. Resources are abundant worldwide, but in the future, they will mainly be found in Indonesia and in the Philippines at a competitive level. The current production capacity is not sufficient. The required investment must be very significant, and Chinese companies currently own a very large part, more than 90% of new projects. This was for nickel. For lithium, which is another essential component of an EV battery, Europe's demands for lithium used for batteries will increase by about 100% between 2030 and 2040, which is the same amount for nickel, 100%. And the main issue for lithium resides in the access to the most competitive resources and efficiency of the process to reduce the environment footprint. Nothing is impossible, but it has to be done properly, to be produced properly. And Eramet, for instance, developed an innovative process to limit hydric resource use, which is the direct lithium extraction. So to quickly match this demand, we must focus on our investment where deposits are large in volumes and competitive in grades, and it is not in Europe. We need first to secure competitive deposits where they are, but owned and operated by European players, developed with the highest ESG standards to address the requirements of the European consumer. Then our supply shall come also from recycling, and the development of urban mining as a true circular economic solution must be supported to alleviate Europe's dependence. 50% of the European demand can be supplied starting from 2030, thanks to recycling. So it is important, and since we need the metals already contained in our smartphones or computer to remain in Europe, to be recycled here, we must create strong regulations enabling us to retain those metals in Europe and to develop a sustainable and competitive recycling industry. New projects shall come on stream quite shortly. In Eramet, we will produce lithium, as you just mentioned, in Argentina by 24. We are accelerating this, and nickel and cobalt for battery by 25 through partnership with BASF in Indonesia.
Yes, thank you, Virginie. You mentioned recycling and how important it is that it stays in Europe, and you've foreshadowed the topic we're going to come to very shortly with Emma. But first, if I can go to you, Julia, on the more general statement that we started with, that you know, the critics of the EV transition will jump upon the fact that this is perhaps not the zero emissions future that we would hope for. They would say that you're just replacing a dependence on oil with a dependence on raw materials, and you know, Virginie mentioned there, you know, raw materials that aren't necessarily available in Europe. And the question I suppose they would ask is how is this more sustainable than the status quo?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks for this question and some really good points raised at the event so far. It was great listening to it from Brussels over here. When we look, and to answer your first maybe question on sustainability and the overall system, when we look at the overall impact, it is of course very important to compare technologies, and that's where we look at the life cycle analysis. We have performed such an analysis as TNE, and we see that already today on today's grids and technologies, an electric vehicle is more than 3 times better on average than a petrol or diesel car it replaces in Europe. A really big chunk of these emissions in this life cycle analysis is really in the use phase. An average petrol car uses 17,000 liters of oil, and it just burns it. The car, it's burned, it's pollution, it clogs our cities, and with all the impact that it raises and all the damage. In comparison, we get rid of that big chunk completely with electric vehicles. Of course, we need materials to produce the batteries, so we need around 150 kilograms of different materials, but this can actually be reused, recovered, recycled to create a circular loop. And that's why from a systems perspective, there's no really question that battery electric vehicles, electrification is a more efficient and a more sustainable system. If we look at dependency on raw materials, it's also important to underline that things that we will need for batteries, be it lithium, be it nickel, in the future actually come from predominantly democratic countries. We're talking about Australia. That's the biggest source of lithium. We're talking about Chile, Canada, or Indonesia, for example. We also have a big supply chain setting up in Europe. Gigafactories, battery factories are coming to have strategic autonomy here. And we have a number of exciting companies with us today on the panel. We have a lot more happening now, more upstream. We still need to do a lot more on refining. That's where we still depend on China, and that's really the next step for European policies. But to finish off, just to say, of course, that the impact in the battery production is still there. Benoit touched upon this as well. This is where the European battery regulation, the new law that's about to be agreed, is so important. It's the first of its kind in the world. It's really a blueprint to have a sustainable battery industry. And it will make sure that any battery that we will be using in Europe will be produced using green energy. It will be sourced, and the materials used in it will be environmentally and responsibly sourced. And finally, it will be recycled at the end of its life. What is really important now is to really accelerate the implementation of that regulation, and also make sure that other global partners, the US, Australia, Japan, all actually embrace similar regulations on their side to make it really a global phenomenon.
Yes, Julia, thank you. You mentioned there the importance of essentially looking at electric vehicles through a sort of life cycle analysis lens and analyzing their carbon footprint and how much carbon you're saving on their entire lifespan, so to speak. And key to that is, of course, the so-called second life of batteries that we're talking about increasingly, i.e., keeping them running for longer, and then recycling batteries at the end of their lives. And Emma, I wanted to come to you on this. We heard, that the battery industry is predominantly dependent on raw materials that are outside of Europe, but that's actually also true for battery recycling, that the vast majority of battery recycling is happening today in Asia. The question really is, will Europe be ready to recycle probably be millions of EV batteries as they come to the end of their life cycle, probably in the next, decade? Oh, I think you're on mute, Gemma.
Sorry, I was...
No problem, it had to happen sometime.
At least on screen this time. I was muted and sent away when we logged in, all of us. Anyway, so we... The answer to this is, of course, we will. I mean, the Asian players were before us. That goes for production, it goes for the material production, it goes for recycling. And they started off in their way of doing things. And that's not 100% suitable for Europe anyways. So even if we could rely on circulating this back to Asia and then buying materials, as Benoit mentioned, that's not the way we do things here in Europe. So we would anyways have to develop something that is more suitable for our sustainability targets and for all the 16 impact factors of the life cycle analysis. We should remember that even if there would be a drive on renewables across the Asian world, and that would bring down the carbon footprint, we would still have significant challenges when it comes to the utilization of all the materials in the batteries. And when it comes to the standards that we set up now in the European recycling, I think that that's something that's going to be never heard of. We are looking to recycle every single bits and piece of a battery, and we hold that very high regardless of the pricing of that respective material. So it's going to be something that is way more complete than the usual way of looking at recycling the more expensive substances in the battery.
So a more complete system. Benoit, going back to the manufacturing of batteries, of course, in this regard, it's also Asia that is essentially has been in the front seat for quite a while. As a new European player in batteries yourself, what are the key challenges that you're facing, or the barriers to commencing production here in Europe, and what role can policymakers in the EU play to help you scale up?
That's an important question. I think you all know that the European Commission has been supporting through the so-called IPCA and also the EBA, European Battery Alliance. I think to reflect on what was said before, we have a unique opportunity when it comes to transferring from ICE to EVs. And one of those opportunities is the fact that we're going to be fully circular from day one, which is unique. But we have to realize and understand what it means. And it means that when you fill your tank in your car, or somehow, and that was said just before, the oil will be burnt and that's it. Huh? When you put lithium, cobalt, manganese, nickel, aluminum in a battery, it will be there forever. We are not using the material. And this is completely a change of paradigm, and that will enable to keep the material, which will enable to also build new batteries later on in Europe. And in that sense, there is a number of topics that are being discussed, but not there yet. One of them is the fact that we need to have sustainable batteries sold in the European territory. That relates to having in the battery regulation an ambitious roadmap to reduce the threshold when it comes to how emitting or how high in terms of CO2 content can a battery be to be sold in the European territory. And we are leading the way worldwide on that topic, and we are to be ambitious enough to really support the development of those gigafactories and local production. The other dimension is to make sure that a used batteries or a scrap battery or a second life battery stays in Europe. Because if we keep completely open the borders, what we will have is kind of a flow of those very, very important materials, and it's also true not only in battery, into other countries that will be really taking care of them to make a new material. Because we need to realize that a battery is the best mine you can imagine to find cobalt for another battery. Because mining cobalt or manganese or lithium, wherever you want to do this in the earth, is difficult because the density of the product is very low. Whereas in a battery, it's already there. So we have to be mindful about that. Make sure we have thresholds to be ambitious when it comes to the CO2 content. And the second one is make sure we keep those materials in the borders because it's where we will be using them. Last comment, maybe in 2040, if we have such a panel, we may see that somehow Europe has become largely sustainable when it comes to those materials because we'll be reusing them but also extracting some. So it's also a way to somehow answer to your point that you raised before, that how we switching from a dependency to another one. I think yes, partly, but only temporarily, and this is also very important to keep that in the mind.
Benoit, you mentioned there that a battery is the best mine you can imagine, which is a quote that, if you'll allow us, may end up in the Financial Times sometime. But Virginie, on that topic, of course, that would be the ideal scenario, that we get most of our raw materials from the batteries that exist. But first, we're going to have to build batteries, and that requires raw materials, and therefore, of course, extraction of those raw materials. I mentioned earlier that you have a lithium project in Argentina. And the question is, how can drivers using technology which will use the raw materials that you extract, how can they be sure that the metals in their car are, extracted without human rights abuses and without enormous environmental damage?
Yes, it's indeed one of the most pressing issues we are facing right now, because we have to get minerals that are not in Europe. At the moment, end consumers have no way to check if their EVs batteries they are driving is respectful of environmental and human rights standards, or on the opposite, as you just mentioned, responsible for damage and perpetuation of HR abuse. The mining industry, in fact, switched from the license to operate to license to sell, since consumers are asking or start asking for more transparency and therefore responsibility and traceability. At Eramet, for instance, ESG is a key differentiator against our non-European competitors, and we are convinced that responsible mining is possible. And as I say, when there's a will, there is a way. And Eramet is committed on a 2018-23 ESG roadmap focused on 13 objectives, answering our key CSR issue, and we also chose to apply to IRMA, and we strongly believe that IRMA is a way, or such standards are a way for the citizens, for the consumers to know what is what materials is made their batteries. IRMA, I think that all the panelists know about IRMA, Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, is part of our journey, because it has the right level of ambition. It offers the good visibility and recognition. It has a strong credibility and simple implementation. IRMA requires transparency, which is now mandatory, to engage the whole ecosystem, and it gives a continuous improvement roadmap that can be used to fix our long-term objectives and to monitor our day-to-day improvements. Since, just to give you some examples, since we impact the resource, we must deliver positive impact with contributive actions to local communities before starting and all along our mining activities. Our actions support a sustainable societal model, employability of young people, education, health, infrastructure improvement, entrepreneurship, and local economic development. And let me just give you some example to be a little bit more concrete. In Argentina, you just talked about Argentina. Keynote project was developed by us for 10 years in cooperation with local communities to build a new business activity, not a mining one, before, so it was 10 years before our production plant even started. Another example, seeds nursery near our mines to ensure the ongoing revegetation and preserve biodiversity, or constant human rights check everywhere the group is active. So IRMA is a way to give us the right framework, and then, because companies, and well, I am here to tell you about Eramet, but there are some others, but in Europe we must demonstrate that our operations are sustainable and how we avoid, minimize or offset our impact. Even if it takes time and money, we call on all players, especially the OEMs and also all players of the mining industry, to comply with these standards and to build a more sustainable world to go on with the EVs.
Thank you, Virginie. Very clear call there for the rest of the industry to comply with standards, and I think that that maybe one of the things when we come to sum up today is part of the picture that it's not just what one company does, but what the whole sector does. And if there is one bad apple, it can really harm everyone's reputation. Julia, on that point, as a representative of an environmental NGO, we heard Virginie talk about the various safeguards that Eramet is putting in place, but generally, do you agree that for this electric era to be made a reality, there will have to be more mining in the future? And if not, I mean, how can we secure enough raw materials to get this transition going in the first place?
Thank you. Excellent, very topical question that many people are discussing right now. We will need a lot of metals. And I think that the current spotlight on the mining sector is actually very helpful. It's an opportunity to improve a lot of things and clean up some players in the industry to avoid some of the practices from the past. Actually, today, the European Commission confirmed that they will come forward with a Raw Materials Act to do exactly that. And we actually very much welcome that. We hope it will also be sustainable Raw Materials Act. But to answer your question on sufficiency, when we look at sufficiency short term, so to 2025, we actually see that even though the market is tight for things such as lithium or nickel, that is not a barrier to accelerate electrification. And something we've discussed on previous panels to go back to the CO2 standards, actually in Europe, if we don't accelerate CO2 standards in the 2020s, we will see stagnation in electric vehicle production, right? So short term, that's not a problem. But going kind of post 2025 and speaking about sufficiency more broadly, we need to first of all answer the question where these materials will come from, and of course, how much. When it comes to where, all these metals do not have to come from more mining. A lot can come from recycling, and setting ambitious policy to ramp up this capacity in Europe is really critical. Cobalt and nickel are mature recycling processes. We can go as high as 99% actually recovery rates. Lithium is also possible to recover in great quantities, over 90%. We have companies like Redwood Materials or Li-Cycle that show it's possible. In Europe today, we lack the framework to do that. And we really hope in the last final months of the battery regulation discussions that legislators go with parliament proposals and set high ambition, so we can get a lot more materials from mining. From recycling. Beyond recycling, there's also substitution and innovation in the industry. Many companies are already moving away from cobalt and nickel. We see a big move to so-called cobalt-free batteries or LFP chemistry. There's a lot of innovation going on. For example, for storage batteries, we might see sodium-ion batteries entering the market shortly. So there's a lot we can do. And ultimately, car makers, as Mr. Rowley was saying earlier, are and need to put some action in to secure those supply chains on time. But that, and to end and to also to add towards the end, it's not just about where all the supply comes from. It's also about how much of these metals we will need. And actually, this is where the efficiency of the broader mobility system is so important. Using a lot more public transport, using shared electric vehicles, electric bikes, will mean we'll need less metals. And even if you are relying on private electric cars, this should be rightly sized and efficient. No one needs to drive in an electric tank. And all of these pickup trucks at the moment driving around Europe, actually on diesel today, is really the worst that we can think of for our mobility. For that, all we need policy. So sufficiency is possible and it can be sustainable, but policies at city level, policies on recycling are needed to make it so.
Yes, thank you. Julia, you mentioned there that a lot can come from recycling, and certainly there are a lot of people who seem confident about that. But Emma, I thought I'd bring this up with you. There are also a lot of naysayers who say that recycling is coming a little bit too late to bridge the current supply chain crunch on raw materials. Firstly, are they right? And how important do you think the contribution from recycling can be? And what does it depend on? In other words, how much of this gap can you fill? Oh, you're on mute again, Emma.
So we have set pretty ambitious targets on this. We have said that by 2030, we expect to be feeding 50% of our recycled raw materials as recycled feed from our own plants. We are building this as we speak. And I don't know if you know it, but we have pretty extensive plans to build mechanical recycling in several sites across Europe. And we're also in Revolt, Northvolt, we're building this hydromet plant in several stages up in Skellefteå, where we are expecting to process 125,000 tons of material that will then feed our Northvolt 1 site with recycled feed. I would say that there is a sort of short-term and long-term perspective also here. If we take the short to mid-term, that will be a ramping of percentage from where we are now, around 25% of the materials being fed as recycled feed from maybe 2023, end of that, and then ramping up to 50, as I said, 2030. But you should also know that we are, and that's pretty high. I mean, that's already on par with some of the regulation milestones that's been set in the proposals. So from Northvolt perspective, I would say that we are definitely very progressive when it comes to how much material that we feed in already now that's recycled. There is also a great need, and we are struggling to feed our plants, but we will definitely be ready to start recycling production as we are ramping also material cathode material production in Northvolt. And then when it comes to the long term, I just want to comment on that. When we see these high recycling feeds, when the EV market is reaching a steady state, meaning when we have equally many EVs coming out on the market as going back into recycling, then we have a completely different story. Then we can actually feed 95% of the feed. So this is a learning period, it's a scaling period. It's about using the opportunities on the market with the recycling need that is out there from the producer's responsibility, but closing this loop will be possible. It will be matured, but it requires a steady state on the market with the cars being recyclable as of that. And I also want to stress the importance of also a pretty harmonized chemistry strategy from anyone who wants to build a plant, so that you know exactly what you need in the future.
A joined up strategy needed. Thank you, Emma. We have time for one more question, and Benoit, you are the lucky panelist to get it. Just briefly on battery durability, this is a question that many consumers have on their minds at the moment. Basically, how long are these batteries gonna last? Some estimates out there, say around 8 years. Others saying that they could last, I don't know, about a couple of decades. Do you expect drivers to have to replace their batteries during the lifetime of their EV?
It's a question that is often raised. I would just want to share one figure with everyone today, which is the fact that a typical EV battery can last, I'll say, 1,000 to 2,000 cycles. One cycle is equivalent to, let's say, 400 kilometers for a typical EV. So if you multiply 400 by 1,000, you go to 400,000 kilometers. If you multiply 400 by 2,000, you can go to 800,000 kilometers. So the thing is, it may happen that the customers will have to replace everything but the battery, because the battery, the powertrain, the engine itself can last much longer than what a typical car can do today. So again, it's a change of complete change of vision. The battery lifetime is fairly important, and the lack of the degradation of the battery is globally much slower than what was expected even by the industry. So I think it's good news, very good news. It's bad news for recycling, because it may happen that we will have to wait a little bit more before being able to feed the recycling loop in Europe. But it's good news, because it also means that the initial investment in carbon that we do to build EV will be there for a very long period of time, and will be an enabler. So maybe the message to all those that are listening today is that if you haven't yet seated in an EV, you need to do that, and you'll get used to a unique experience. And that car may last longer than you expect. So make the right choice when you choose a car.
Thank you, Benoit. That was almost perfectly to time. Yeah, you're welcome back anytime. It only remains for me just to sum up in conclusion, having listened to today's keynote and debates and panels. From my perspective, sitting here, we started with Pascal Canfin telling us that you can count on him, and the question he raised was whether he can count on all of the other so-called stakeholders in this process. And we've heard the word complex quite a lot today from the various representatives of politics and industry and unions, etc., and indeed battery technology. And the one thing that's become very, very clear, I think, is that every part of this picture is important in order to get us to this 2035 target. So we had member states saying that they need industry to reach their targets. We have industry, we have Ford, for example, saying the infrastructure needs to be there. Unions saying the workers' rights need to be protected. Consumer groups saying that their consumers need to be helped through this transition. And now lastly, batteries and that picture, and being told very clearly that we need to make sure, A, we have a battery industry in Europe, B, that we manage to get those raw materials needed, and C, that we, Benoit, as you put it so well, we keep those batteries in Europe. And so if there's one clear message that I take away from it today, it's that there's a concerted effort needed to get us over this line. But only remains for me to thank our panel, Benoit, Virginie, Julia, and Emma, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us both in person and virtually today. And for more on this debate in the weeks ahead, do stay tuned to transportenvironment.org, where I'm sure there'll be many updates as we get closer to some concrete decisions. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening and being with us.
Hello, everybody.